Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Juan Peña Mejorado wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the last few years, including our recent review of the Juan Peña Gesha, a natural processed Ecuadorian coffee. And of the Mejorados that we do routinely review on this channel, I do have to say that Juan Peña has consistently had one of my favorites, as I do find them to be on the cleaner and sweeter side of things, even relative to a lot of other Mejorados that we do review on this channel. So seeing September release this coffee and having never reviewed it from them before, it immediately caught my interest, and we will see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is also one of their standard offerings, as I do know that they offered this one in an extra light for extra light subscribers only. That being said, we continuously harp on the fact that September is on the lighter side of things and do compare their coffees to being on the lighter side of things relative to even some of Say's more recent offerings. So for that reason, we will call this one on the moderately light side by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 25, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was expectedly nice, as it was offering a slightly higher than average level of sweetness, which was very much on par with our expectations for a Mejorado coffee. In addition to that, there were some traces of some stone fruit, but the general feeling is that this coffee will need some time to open up, but it was a positive start nonetheless. Let's go ahead and move on to day 28, as we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was offering a pretty similar experience this time around, with a slightly more generic Mejorado feel, and the focus being on some slight stone fruit brightness as opposed to the overall sweetness. Moderately sweet this time around with some complementary white florality, but the coffee still feels like it needs some time to open up. It's been solid so far, if not necessarily spectacular. Day 31 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee is better as it has slightly opened up, leading a little bit more into those stone fruit qualities with plenty of that classic Mejorado sweetness as well. A slightly generic citric quality to go with a bit of white florals, but generally it's been on the more intense side of things, relatively speaking, so better overall. And as of this moment, we were still kind of working with the lower extraction adjustments that is suggested on the UFO brewer's brew guide. So for that reason, we went 92 degrees Celsius on this one, and I felt like maybe that's the direction we should have gone with this coffee, so that's the way we went. And on day 34, we opted for the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments, so just to 94 degrees Celsius. And I immediately felt like we needed to revert back to our standard profile, or our standard recipe actually, as it was notably less intense and it offered a slightly more generic Mejorado feel, with some of these citric qualities still at the forefront this time around. Much more average level of sweetness, especially for a Mejorado. For that reason, I felt like there were some adjustments definitely needed on this one. Day 37 through the Chemex with some higher extraction adjustments, so we wondered, let's see what happens if we go the other direction. And it was a little bit better, as there's a little bit more sweetness and brightness overall, and a slightly more candied aspect, which was what I was expecting for this coffee going into it. A little bit more floral than expected, otherwise it still primarily focuses on the citric attributes at the forefront with some slight stone fruits on the back end, and I'm not entirely sure which of those qualities was supposed to be the most dominant characteristic, but as of this moment I actually found it to be a little bit more citric forward than I was hoping for. I was definitely hoping that this one would offer a wildly sweet stone fruit-like experience. Day 40 back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it feels like there's a bit more to be had with this coffee. I'll be completely honest, I was stumped, as it was still pretty clean and sweet, but not necessarily to the expectations that I had. Granted, I went into this coffee with some extremely high expectations, one of our favorite coffee roasters, one of our favorite coffees, or easily one of our favorite varietals, and as of this moment it hasn't lived up to those expectations, as it's been solid once again, if not spectacular, as it continues to remain a little bit more citric forward. Outside of that, there's a dark berry in the intermediary with a relatively well-defined white peach sense in the finish, so I was starting to see a little bit more of that, a little bit more of that sugary peach quality to it, as opposed to that more ripe, fresh fruit peachiness that I usually prefer in coffees. Day 43, through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it feels like the coffee might finally be opening up a bit, as there's a much more inline experience with what we've had of other of the Mejorado coffees from Juan Peña in the past. as it feels like there's greater sweetness, better definition to that white peach quality. So this time around I said, this is much better. This is much more in line with the expectations that I did have. So maybe this coffee is just taking an extended period of time to really open up. And on day 46, through the Chemex was our standard recipe, and it felt like there's a little bit of inconsistency as the coffee this time around is mostly lemon tea forward. Slight white peach, nectarine, honeysuckle, and tangerine. Those are the other qualities that I did pull out from this coffee, and that did rhyme, which is kind of funny. But yes, let's go ahead and transition on over into the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Very clean coffee. I've said going into this that Juan Peña's Mejorados do tend to be some of the more clean Mejorados that we do experience as well. I don't have anything to knock it in terms of the overall cleanliness to it. Pretty straightforward, pretty direct on this one. Finish level 4. Mixed impressions on the finish. Now, going into this, I did want the finish to be a lot more sweet, a lot more lingering, a lot more of those kind of candied aspects to it. But as you can kind of see, we'll briefly discuss this. The caramel's at a level 2, mostly because there wasn't that expected Mejorado sweetness to this one in that long-lasting sense. It was still a pretty sweet coffee. I think if we're comparing this alongside of your other standard varietals out there, then yes, it's still going to be on the sweeter side of things. But relative to Mejorados, it kind of falls into the middle of the pack, especially for that candied sweetness, which isn't quite as abundant as I was looking for. So level 2 where we opted to put that, but since we're discussing the finish, it goes to show that I was really hoping for more of that. It's a little bit more citric forward in that finish. Sweetness level 4, as mentioned, still pretty sweet. Still in comparison to your average everyday coffee, it's going to score higher than them. But as far as Mejorados go, right there in the middle of the pack, there are definitely some of Juan Peña's Mejorados I've had in the past. Probably thinking of the Flower Child one that was very, very sweet. So for that reason, that's a little bit of a sticking point to me. It's very high expectations when you're kind of disappointed that the coffee's only scoring a level 4 for sweetness. Acidity, level 4. This would be one of the brighter Juan Peña Mejorados that we've reviewed, as well as I didn't see that going into this one, but it's still so citric lemon forward in terms of that brightness as well that it scored pretty high. And I said, when we're reviewing Mejorado coffees, they can finish between that 3 and the 4 in terms of brightness, but this one was pretty straightforward, pretty direct, right there at that level 4, definitely on the brighter side of things. Florality level 4, I couldn't get a great gauge of a specific floral quality to it. Honeysuckle is what I came up with towards the end, which is very much in line with a lot of other Mejorados that we've reviewed, Juan Peña's Mejorado specifically as well. And for that reason, it did reach that level 4 mark, but most of the time it was a little bit more of a generic white florality. I think towards the end it was becoming a bit more defined. I think this coffee still is opening up ever so slightly, even at the time that we're brewing it today. So level 4 where we opted to put it, though not necessarily in the most well-defined sense. Citrus fruit level 4. That honestly a little bit of a sticking point for me because I don't love when the Mejorado coffees are this citric forward, and this one definitely did skew a lot more in that sense. It was the most dominant characteristic of this coffee, and when it comes to a Mejorado, I want the sweetness to be the most dominant characteristic. So level 4 where we opted to put that pretty high within this one. Stone fruit level 4. I have to say it's a much more generic stone fruit for me, and I can see that white sugary peach to it, and even though it's pretty abundant, not necessarily to the same extent as the citric qualities in this one, it still scored that level 4 just because of how abundant it is. Again, in a slightly less defined sense though, so level 4 where we opted to put that. And then the final thing we're discussing, actually, we'll go ahead and move on to that. That is going to be the body level 3. That's another thing when it comes to these Mejorado coffees. They can fluctuate somewhere between the 2 and the 3. It's been pretty interesting to me that the 2 coffees that we have had from September, both these Juan Peñas, have scored level 4 for brightness and level 3 for body. And I feel like that's a really nice selling point to a majority of people. It's 2 stuff that I don't care about as much as a lot of other people, but seeing this one have a little bit more body and a little bit more brightness, I can see why it would appeal to a lot of other people. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let's start with this. There were sky-high expectations for this coffee going into it. I did want it to be a very strong contender for one of my favorite coffees of the entire year. And if I'm being completely honest, there are definitely other Juan Peña Mejorados I've had in the past that I have enjoyed more than this one. Again, I'm thinking of that Flower Child one that did end up on our honorable mentions list last year and could have easily finished in our top 10 had it not been, I guess, scored out by the other Ecuadorian coffees that finished on there. And even the one from H&S, the Juan Peña that we had last year, I feel like I enjoyed more than this one. That being said, there are definitely a number of Juan Peña Mejorados that I enjoyed this one significantly more than. The one I'm thinking of most recently is the one that we had from Acid, but that's probably going to be because the profile of this one was significantly lighter. So this one does fall a little bit more in the middle of the pack than I was necessarily hoping for. I did want to get a sample of the extra light offering to see how that one might have differed from this coffee, but given that this is the standard profile and this is what they were going for with this coffee, I can kind of see why it turned out the way that it did. And that does kind of take us into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one has a Mejorado characteristic to it, but also in a more traditional sense, because I still feel like a lot of people prioritize those two specific aspects that are a give or take for us. That body, definitely more body, and that brightness, definitely more brightness. And if you really like the citric qualities of your coffee as well, it has those three things in abundance, much more so than the average Mejorado coffee, while still offering plenty of cleanliness and sweetness as well, maybe not necessarily to the same extent that I'm looking for, but plenty of those qualities nonetheless, complemented by some stone fruit and floral qualities, giving it an additional bit of depth. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Juan Peña Mejorado wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.